It started with a line of bright orange cones placed across my driveway like a silent threat, as if someone had decided my own property no longer belonged to me. No warning, no explanation, just a bold move that instantly turned an ordinary afternoon into a showdown over power, control, and ego. The kind of move only an HOA enforcer convinced of their own authority would make. I remember sitting there, engine idling, realizing this wasn't really about cones at all. It was about who they thought could be pushed around. And that's when I made a decision that changed everything. Before any cones showed up, before rules were weaponized and common sense disappeared, life in the neighborhood was quiet in the way most planned communities promise to be. The kind of place marketed with neat lawns, matching mailboxes, and an HOA that claimed to exist only to protect property values and keep things orderly. I had moved there for exactly that reason: stability, predictability. A place where you could come home after a long day, pull into your driveway, and not feel like you were being watched. I lived alone, worked long hours, and kept to myself. My house was modest but well-maintained. The driveway was clean, the grass trimmed, the exterior untouched since the day I moved in. I wasn't the type to stir trouble or challenge authority. I paid my HOA dues on time, skimmed the newsletters, and followed the obvious rules without complaint. From the outside, I was exactly the kind of resident HOAs love to point to as proof their system works. The driveway itself was nothing special, just a standard concrete stretch leading from the street to my garage. It had always been mine to use, just as it had been for every previous owner of the home. No easements, no shared access, no strange boundary lines. It was clearly marked on the property map and had never once been mentioned in any HOA correspondence. It was simply there, part of the house, part of daily life, and entirely unremarkable. The neighborhood, however, had its quirks. There were residents who took the HOA role far more seriously than others, people who treated bylaws like sacred text and saw enforcement as a personal calling rather than a volunteer duty. Yard measurements were inspected with near military precision. Trash cans left out too long became a source of quiet outrage. Parking rules were a constant topic of passive-aggressive emails. None of it directly involved me, but it was impossible not to notice the underlying tension that simmered beneath the surface. Over time, one particular figure began to stand out, someone who seemed to move through the neighborhood with an air of self-appointed authority, always watching, always ready to correct. The kind of person who believed rules mattered more than context and enforcement mattered more than fairness. I didn't interact with them directly at first, but their presence was hard to miss. Notices would appear on doors, cones would pop up near curbs, cars would suddenly be labeled as violations for reasons that felt deliberately vague. Still, none of that seemed like my problem. I came and went without incident. I used my driveway the same way I always had. I parked my vehicle, locked my garage, and focused on my own life. If anything, I felt insulated from the pettiness around me. I assumed that as long as I stayed within the obvious lines, no one would have a reason to single me out. That assumption was what made everything that followed so jarring. The first sign that something was off came subtly. A notice slipped into my mailbox that didn't apply to me, referencing a rule I hadn't violated. Then a follow-up email that felt oddly specific, as if someone was watching my routine a little too closely. Nothing actionable, nothing clear, just enough to plant the idea that attention had shifted in my direction. I brushed it off. HOAs made mistakes all the time, and this felt like administrative noise more than a threat. But the feeling of being observed lingered. The sense that something ordinary was about to become a problem simply because someone decided it should be. I had no idea that my driveway, the most mundane part of my property, was about to become the center of a dispute that would drag my name through HOA records, expose the fragility of neighborhood authority, and turn a quiet street into a stage for one person's need to control others. At the time, I still believed reason would prevail. I still believed rules existed to serve the community, not individual egos. And I definitely didn't believe that a few pieces of plastic would ever be used to challenge my right to access my own home. That belief wouldn't last much longer. What followed after that first strange notice was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, deliberate tightening of pressure. The kind that makes you question your own understanding of reality before you realize someone else is rewriting it. The HOA's attention didn't arrive loudly. It crept in through paperwork, markings, and silent actions that were impossible to ignore once they began. The next notice arrived less than a week later. This one was more specific, referencing driveway usage and temporary obstruction concerns. It didn't accuse me of anything outright, but it framed my normal routine as a potential violation. It was worded carefully, almost surgical. Nothing concrete to dispute, but enough to imply that my use of my own driveway was suddenly under scrutiny. It was unsettling, not because it made sense, but because it didn't. I checked the bylaws, then I checked them again. Driveways were considered private property, maintained by the homeowner, unrestricted except for commercial use or permanent structural changes. None of that applied to me. There was no mention of cones, restrictions, or HOA authority over access unless emergency services were involved. On paper, everything was clear. In practice, something was shifting. Within days, the first physical sign appeared. Bright orange cones lined the curb near my driveway, not blocking it outright, but close enough to feel intentional. They weren't there when I left for work that morning. They were there when I came home. No notice, no explanation, just plastic barriers placed with a confidence that expected compliance. I moved them aside and parked as usual. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it was treated as an act of defiance. An email followed that night, referencing tampering with HOA safety measures. The language was suddenly sharper, the tone more authoritative. It accused me of interfering with a placement intended to maintain uniform traffic flow. There was no traffic issue on our street. There never had been. It was a quiet residential loop where kids rode bikes and neighbors waved as they passed. The justification felt manufactured, a flimsy excuse draped over a power play. The cones returned the next day, this time positioned directly across the entrance to my driveway. They weren't subtle anymore. They were a statement, a challenge. Someone had decided to test how far they could go. I documented everything: photos, timestamps, screenshots of emails, copies of the bylaws. I knew enough to understand that if this escalated, clarity would matter. What I didn't expect was how quickly escalation would become the goal. A fine appeared on my HOA account before the week was over, a non-compliance fee for failure to adhere to temporary access restrictions. The amount wasn't devastating, but it was symbolic. It transformed inconvenience into punishment. It was no longer just about cones. It was about asserting authority where none existed. I submitted a written dispute, citing the relevant sections of the bylaws and attaching photos of my unobstructed driveway from prior months. The response came back cold and dismissive, acknowledging receipt but offering no resolution. Just a reminder that continued non-compliance could result in additional fines or corrective action taken on my behalf at my expense. The wording was deliberate, vague enough to intimidate, broad enough to justify almost anything. Neighbors began to notice. Some avoided eye contact. Others lingered a little longer when walking past, clearly curious but unwilling to get involved. HOA politics had a way of isolating people, turning shared frustration into silent observation. No one wanted to be next. The cones became a routine. Every morning they appeared, every evening I moved them, and every time I did, another note was added to my file. The fines stacked slowly at first, then faster. Each one carried the same hollow explanation, as if copied and pasted without thought. Then came the warning about towing. It arrived in the form of a brightly colored sticker placed on my garage door, announcing that unauthorized vehicles parked in restricted areas were subject to removal. It didn't name me, but it didn't need to. There was only one driveway being treated as restricted. The implication was clear: comply or lose access to your vehicle. I contacted the HOA board directly, requesting clarification and a formal hearing. The response redirected me back to the enforcement officer, the same figure whose presence had hovered over the neighborhood for months. The system fed back into itself, circular and impenetrable. The enforcement actions grew more theatrical. Chalk markings appeared near my tires. Additional cones were added, forming a neat little barricade that extended into the street. A laminated notice was zip-tied to one of them, citing safety concerns without specifics. It was absurd, but it was also effective. It made using my driveway feel like an act of rebellion. I stopped feeling comfortable in my own home. Every arrival carried the tension of anticipation. Would there be a new notice? A new fine? Would someone be waiting to document my reaction? The sense of being watched became constant, like a low hum that never shut off. I considered giving in, parking on the street, avoiding the confrontation, letting the HOA win simply to restore peace. But each time that thought surfaced, it collided with the reality of what was being asked of me: to surrender a basic property right without justification, to validate an abuse of power by complying with it. I ordered a professional survey just to be certain. When it arrived, it confirmed exactly what I already knew. The driveway was entirely within my property line. No shared access, no easements, no ambiguity. It was mine, unequivocally. I submitted the survey to the HOA. The response was silence. The fines continued, late fees were added, the tone of the notices shifted again, becoming more urgent, more threatening. Language about corrective measures and board-approved action appeared. The stakes were rising, and still no one would explain why. One afternoon, I came home to find a vehicle partially across my driveway, positioned in a way that made entry impossible. It bore an HOA logo on the door. The message couldn't have been clearer if it had been spelled out in flashing lights. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about dominance. I took photos. I documented the obstruction. I sent another dispute. The vehicle was gone by morning, but the message lingered. That night, I reviewed everything: the bylaws, the survey, the notices, the fines. A pattern emerged, and it wasn't accidental. This was a test case, a demonstration. Someone had decided to see how far HOA authority could stretch before snapping. The realization shifted something in me. The frustration hardened into resolve. If this was going to end, it wouldn't be through passive resistance or unanswered emails. It would require a moment decisive enough to force accountability. The next morning, the cones were back, more of them than ever, arranged carefully, deliberately, blocking my driveway completely. They were positioned with precision, as if placed by someone confident they wouldn't be challenged. I stood there for a long moment, engine rumming, staring at the plastic barrier that came to represent weeks of intimidation and control. The fines, the threats, the quiet erosion of my rights.
And that's when I realized the HOA had made a critical mistake. They assumed I would keep playing defense. They assumed I would eventually back down. They assumed the cones would be enough. They were wrong. The morning everything broke open didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt heavy, the kind of quiet that settles in before something irreversible happens. The cones were already there when I stepped outside, more than before, arranged with deliberate care. They didn't just block the driveway, they erased it. From the street, it looked like my home no longer had an entrance at all, as if access had been revoked by sheer audacity. What made it worse wasn't the plastic or the inconvenience, it was the confidence behind it. Someone had woken up that morning believing they had the unquestioned authority to deny me access to my own property, believing the paper trail of vague notices and mounting fines had worn me down enough to comply, believing I would finally yield. Instead, something snapped into focus. Weeks of documentation ran through my mind: the bylaws, the survey, the unanswered disputes, the HOA vehicle blocking my driveway days earlier, the fines stacked neatly in their system like a scoreboard. This wasn't confusion anymore. It was intentional obstruction. And for the first time since it began, the imbalance of power shifted. I didn't touch the cones right away. I took photos from every angle, slow and methodical. The placement, the distance into the street, the way they extended beyond my property line. I captured the entire scene, not out of fear, but out of certainty. This was no longer a private annoyance, it was evidence. The 4x4 sat in the driveway behind me, engine off, quiet and waiting. It had been there through every notice and fine, a constant presence in the background of the dispute. At that moment, it stopped feeling like a vehicle and started feeling like a line that had already been crossed too many times. I got in and started the engine. The sound cut through the stillness of the street, low and steady. Neighbors who had learned to look away before now lingered behind windows. Curtains shifted. A garage door across the street paused halfway open. The quiet attention of the entire block settled in, not loud, not obvious, but unmistakable. I eased forward. The first cone tipped instantly, folding under the tire with a hollow crunch that echoed louder than it should have. The second followed, then the third. There was no hesitation, no dramatic acceleration, just steady movement, the kind that communicated certainty rather than rage. The cones collapsed one by one, scattered aside like props that had overstayed their welcome. In seconds, the driveway existed again. I pulled out onto the street and stopped, not to flee, but to finish documenting the aftermath. Crushed cones, displaced barriers, a clear path where none had been allowed moments earlier. The visual contrast was striking. The authority the HOA had tried to project lay flattened and exposed. I parked, walked back, and took more photos. The evidence now included not just obstruction, but the result of it. Proof that their control relied entirely on compliance, and that once challenged, it had nothing behind it but noise. That afternoon, the response came fast. The HOA account updated with multiple violations all at once, emergency enforcement fees, property damage charges, a notice of intent to escalate. It was frantic, almost panicked, like an institution realizing too late that it had pushed too far and needed to reassert dominance immediately. The amounts were absurd, the justifications thinner than ever. What they didn't realize was that their escalation had crossed a threshold. I forwarded everything to an attorney specializing in property and HOA law, not with a long explanation, but with a clean, chronological package of facts, photos, dates, bylaws, survey, notices, fines, evidence of obstruction, evidence of retaliation. The response came back quicker than expected. The phrase, "clear overreach," stood out. Within days, a formal letter went out not disputing a single fine, but challenging the HOA's authority altogether. It outlined the lack of jurisdiction over private driveway access, cited the repeated obstruction as interference with property rights, and flagged potential liability for harassment and selective enforcement. It didn't ask for clarification, it demanded cessation. The effect was immediate. The cones vanished overnight, not moved, not repositioned, gone. The enforcement notices stopped arriving. The HOA vehicles stopped circling the block. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, but it was telling. It was the sound of a system recalculating. Then came the meeting. I wasn't present, but the aftermath was impossible to miss. Emails circulated to the entire community addressing recent enforcement misunderstandings. Language softened. Phrases like procedural review and corrective oversight appeared. The driveway restriction was quietly retracted without admission of fault. The fines were removed from my account without explanation. But the real turning point wasn't administrative, it was social. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact before now nodded in passing. A few left notes expressing relief that someone had finally pushed back. Stories surfaced about similar experiences that had never made it this far because people were too tired, too busy, or too intimidated to fight. The cones hadn't just blocked a driveway, they had symbolized a pattern, and that pattern was breaking. The enforcement officer's presence disappeared almost entirely. Notices became rare. The tone of HOA communication shifted from authoritative to cautious. Where there had once been confidence, there was now restraint. The power dynamic had changed, not because the rules had been rewritten, but because their misuse had been exposed. Still, the climax wasn't complete. A final letter arrived weeks later, addressed not just to me, but to the entire board. It outlined potential legal exposure if similar actions continued. It cited my case as an example without naming me directly. It didn't threaten, it documented, and that made it far more dangerous to ignore. The HOA responded by announcing a revision of enforcement procedures and a temporary suspension of certain discretionary actions. No apology, no admission, but a clear retreat. Standing in my driveway that evening, unobstructed and quiet once again,
I felt something deeper than relief. Vindication, yes, but also clarity. The realization that power like this survives only in silence, that rules are often less dangerous than the people who believe they are above them. The cones had been meant to humiliate, to intimidate, to force submission through inconvenience and paperwork. Instead, they became the moment everything turned. Because once they were crushed, flattened under the weight of something solid and undeniable, there was no pretending this was about safety or order anymore. It was about control. And control had just lost its grip. What came next would determine whether the HOA learned from that moment or tried one last time to remind everyone who they thought was in charge. The weeks that followed didn't come with fireworks or public apologies. They came with something far more meaningful: silence where pressure used to be. The driveway remained clear every morning. No cones, no notices, no emails crafted to intimidate. The absence of interference felt almost unreal at first, like waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear that something fundamental had changed. The fines that had accumulated so aggressively were gone, not reduced, not negotiated, erased. The HOA account showed a clean slate, as if the entire ordeal had never happened. The language used in official communications softened across the board. Enforcement updates became infrequent and carefully worded. Where there had once been confidence bordering on arrogance, there was now hesitation. It wasn't just my situation that shifted. The neighborhood itself seemed to exhale. Small changes became noticeable. Cones stopped appearing on random curbs. Warning stickers vanished. The obsessive scrutiny that had hovered over lawns, trash cans, and parked vehicles eased. People began using their driveways and sidewalks without glancing over their shoulders. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The power that had once thrived on fear had lost its momentum. The enforcement officer who had been so visible before was suddenly absent. No slow patrols, no staged interventions, no presence meant to remind residents they were being watched. Their authority had not been officially revoked, but it had been rendered ineffective. Everyone could feel it. Once exposed, it no longer carried the same weight. The HOA board announced procedural updates under the guise of transparency and improvement. New language emphasized homeowner rights and compliance review. Committees were formed. Oversight mechanisms were mentioned. None of it referenced the driveway directly, but it didn't have to. The message was clear enough. Boundaries had been crossed, and they had been noticed. What struck me most wasn't the administrative cleanup. It was the quiet shift in how people interacted. Neighbors who had once avoided involvement began sharing stories in passing. Similar notices, arbitrary fines, rules enforced inconsistently depending on who you were or how likely you were to push back. The experience hadn't been unique. It had simply gone further than most because it finally met resistance. Some admitted they had wanted to speak up before but didn't know how. Others confessed they had assumed the HOA always had the final say. The cones had shattered that illusion. They proved that authority without foundation collapses the moment it's tested. Life slowly returned to normal, but it wasn't the same normal as before. There was a sharper awareness now, a collective understanding that rules needed to be read, not just accepted, that bylaws were not weapons unless people allowed them to be. The neighborhood didn't become rebellious, but it became informed. For me, the emotional aftermath lingered longer than the logistical one. Weeks of tension don't evaporate overnight. There was still a reflexive pause every time I pulled into the driveway, half expecting obstruction. Still a flicker of irritation when an HOA email appeared in my inbox, even when it was harmless. But over time, that edge dulled. What replaced it was something steadier. Confidence, not the loud kind, but the grounded kind that comes from the knowing where you stand, knowing your rights, knowing that intimidation only works when unanswered. The driveway itself never changed. Same concrete, same angle, same garage door at the end. But it felt different. It no longer represented vulnerability or inconvenience. It represented the moment control failed, the place where an overreach met its limit. The long-term consequences for the HOA were subtle but lasting. Enforcement became more consistent, less personal. Discretion was used cautiously. Complaints were reviewed more carefully. The fear of liability had done what no amount of resident frustration ever could. It forced accountability. There was no revenge, no victory lap. That wasn't the point. The satisfaction came from restoration, not retaliation, from reclaiming something that should never have been taken in the first place. Looking back, it's clear how easily it could have gone differently. I could have parked on the street and avoided the conflict. I could have paid the fines and hoped it stopped. I could have accepted inconvenience as the cost of peace. And that's exactly what the system had been counting on. HOA overreach doesn't survive because it's right. It survives because it's exhausting to fight. It depends on the assumption that most people won't push back, won't document, won't challenge authority cloaked in official language. The cones weren't about safety or order. They were a test of compliance. And once that test failed, the entire structure wobbled. The experience changed how I see neighborhood governance altogether. HOAs aren't inherently corrupt or malicious, but they are uniquely vulnerable to abuse. When power is localized, informal, and lightly supervised, it attracts personalities that mistake enforcement for entitlement. Without resistance, those personalities grow bolder. The most important lesson wasn't legal, it was psychological. Bullies don't stop because they're asked nicely. They stop when their actions carry consequences, when their authority is questioned, when their confidence is punctured. Standing up didn't require shouting or confrontation. It required patience, documentation, a refusal to accept nonsense simply because it arrived on official letterhead. The decisive moment wasn't dramatic because it was angry. It was dramatic because it was final. It ended the game they were playing. Months later, the driveway remains unobstructed. The neighborhood remains calm. The HOA still exists, but it operates differently now, more carefully, more quietly, as it should have all along. Sometimes I think about how ridiculous it all was, how a few pieces of plastic escalated into a defining moment of control and resistance, how something so small revealed something so big. But that's often how power exposes itself, in minor inconveniences that demand submission. The cones are gone now, probably stacked in a storage room somewhere waiting for the next opportunity. But if they ever return, they'll do so in a neighborhood that knows better, one that understands that authority without limits is just another form of trespass. The real impact of that day wasn't just reclaiming a driveway, it was reminding an entire community that rights don't disappear just because someone says they do, that silence is consent, and consent can be withdrawn. And the next time someone decides to test how far they can push, they might remember what happened when a simple driveway became a line in the concrete that couldn't be crossed without consequences.